Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Jim, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. I'm very excited to talk with you. Can you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yeah, thank you, Robbie. My name is Jim Gochenaur, and I'm 77 years old. And in the early 70s, 1970 to the first month in 72, I was involved in conversations with Secret Service agent in charge of the Seattle district, Elmer Moore, his assistant, Carl Hardy, and my landlord, who was an ex-FBI agent by the name of Carver Gayton. Uh, these conversations were, I would say, conversations. They definitely weren't question answer type of things until in 1971, May 7th, the seventh day in May, I was talking with Elmer Moore, and it was a question answer type of thing. With Carver Gayton, it was more of him just simply talking about his experiences and working with James P. Hosty of the FBI, who was in Dallas at the time of the assassination of President Kennedy. Now, this all started in February of 1970. At that particular time, I was in a Master of Fine Arts program at the University of Washington. And one of the requirements for completing that program was to teach at least one or two classes in one of Seattle's public high schools. And one of the things that I did when I first got there in 69 was that I signed up to be teaching ceramics at Garfield High School, South Central part of Seattle. And the art department chairman at that time, in February of 1970, he put up a thing that the teachers and the students put together a large art show in May of 1970. And so what my class and I did was try to figure out what the theme of the material that we were going to submit. And I showed slides of the Minoan and ancient Greek ceramics and noted that on these pieces of art, they depicted their respective mythology and their history and whimsical themes. And I said, let's take a current event in the last 20 years or so and try to depict it. And what you had your choice, a thrown pottery or, ceramic sculpture. And everybody agreed that that would be a cool thing to do. So what I did is, what was I going to contribute? And I thought, well, I better go to my favorite place, which was a used bookstore on University Way and Brooklyn Avenue in Seattle near the university. I always browsed through there for images and ideas. And I came across a book called 4 Days. It was an United Press International cooperative thing with different newspapers. And what struck my eye, it was, the UPS and under it, Milwaukee Sentinel. So that was my hometown. So I thought, hey, I just paged through it. And one of the things that I noticed was on page 18 of that book was Mary Moorman's famous photograph of the instant JFK is getting shot. And I noticed that there was some sort of image on the fence. And I thought, well, maybe I can get a clear resolution of that. because what I was going to do is I was going to make a photo silk screen of it and apply colored underglazes to produce an image. So I said, "Who's help me? I don't know how to get a hold of a better resolution of that." And I called the local FBI agent, local FBI station in Seattle on the 23rd of February of 1970. Very polite agent talked with me, and he says, "I don't think we can help you, but I know who would." And I said, "Oh, who's that?" And he said, "Well, hold on the line. I'm going to connect you directly to Secret Agent Elmer Moore." And I waited, and all of a sudden it was, "This is Elmer Moore. How can I help you?" So I told him that what I was looking for. And one of the things that he said that I stood out right away is, "Well, I personally handled that photograph. And you're out of luck, Jim. There's no way of getting a good resolution on it because there's no negative. It was a Polaroid." And then he just jumped into this thing about, "Why are you a critic? Have you ever read the full 26 volumes of the Warren Report?" And I said, "No." I said I hadn't. And he says, "Well, you're probably uh, an apostle of Mark Lane." And I says, "I know who he is, but I've never read any of his material. And I'm not really a critic. All I want is a better resolution of that photograph." And he said, "Well, I can't help you on that. Uh, I gave and this is really funny. He says, I gave it to the National Photo Interpretation Center in Bethesda, Maryland. And then when I got it back, I gave it to the FBI." So it was kind of weird. At any rate, the conversation continued. He said, "The experience of being involved as a lead investigator for the Secret Service made me a student of American political assassinations." And he said, that right from when Andrew Jackson, the attempt on him by Richard, I believe his name was Richard Lawrence, to all the way up through this century. They're all crazy, one
Lone assassins.
nuts that were completely and totally insane or had strange grievances. And I said, "Well, when in high school, in my history class, I made part of my project for getting through the junior year was to study the Civil War. And I chose to look up John Wilkes Booth."
Abraham Lincoln. Yeah.
And I said, "This guy had about 11 or 12 accomplices." And he says, "Yes, but he was so central to the plot, you can say that he was a lone assassin." And I said, "That's not right." uh, he went back and forth from Montreal with lots and lots of money, and he definitely was uh, at least an informant for the Confederate Secret Service. And then I went on to say that when I was looking up Lincoln's assassination, I came across a very interesting event that happened in March of 1864. At that time, somebody gave the authorization for a cavalry raid on Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. And one of the wings of this cavalry raid was led by a man by the name of Colonel Ulrich Dahlgren. Dahlgren and his men were unfortunately intercepted by the Confederate Home Guard, and he was killed. And his papers were taken. And in those papers, there was handwritten notes to liberate a prisoner of war camp, arm them, sack Richmond, and capture Jefferson Davis and his cabinet, or kill him. And it was a situation was taken in, and Richmond newspapers splattered it all over and got into it. Jefferson Davis actually addressed his cabinet about it. And there was a man by the name of Jonah Benjamin, who had held Secretary of State and other things in the cabinet of Jefferson Davis. And right away, there was an idea of revenge. I surmised that they gave the assignment to Booth, how to pull off either capturing or killing Lincoln in retaliation. At that point, Elmer Moore said, "Hey, can you spell Dahlgren's name?" And so he got involved. He started talking about President Garfield, and he felt there was something fishy about that, but didn't get into it. And then we talked about the guy that shot and killed McKinley, and the attempted assassination in Milwaukee, by the way, of Theodore Roosevelt. And so this went on for a while, and then he said, I said, what did you actually do as lead investigator? And he said, well, with Inspector Tom Kelly, who ran the show, and the agent in charge down there, Sorrells, and I would meet in the late afternoon or into the evening, and we would make assignments for the various agents that came in. This was all done until President Johnson required that the FBI take over the investigation. And then he said that, I know you're a student at U of Washington. I'll tell you what, I'll be your professor, and I'll give you an assignment for getting me 3 good questions about the interview I was involved in with Chief Justice Warren Ford and the Chief Counsel Rankin in June of 64, and read it and give me 3 good questions and call me back in about a month or so, and maybe we can get together for a lunch and discuss all this stuff.
You opened them up.
Well, what happened is that I did call him about a month later. In between that time, I sort of dismissed it. I was too busy. But the thing that I did is that I went over to the U of Washington's library, which had the 26 volumes. And I started reading that, and it was very interesting. There was a segment in there where Rankin said, well, they're talking to Jack Ruby, and they say, Mr. Ruby, we have information that you had met in the Carousel Club with J.D. Tibbet and a man by the name of Bernard Wiseman and an oil man. And what struck me is that Ruby's reply was, who was the oil man? And I thought, well, wait a minute, I think that Rankin should follow up on this, but he didn't. He just went on to another question. And I that was one of the questions. The other question was that Ruby was very interested in having either truth serum or a polygraph test to make sure that he was telling the truth. And Moore told me that he was a registered polygraph examiner in the state of California. Ruby says, well, Elmer, is this, you think it's a good idea? And Moore said, no. So that was the other question. Why did you say no? And then I was going to go to the very obvious thing. Why don't they then it take me to uh, Washington because it's unsafe for me here to talk. And I called him. I called Moore. And I talked with him in February 23rd. I think it was probably about the mid-April. And I said, I'm following up. I want to ask you to talk about three interesting questions about that interview. And he just started, well, we couldn't take him to Washington. There was no protocols for that. And we would have to spend a lot of time getting the security together. And then he said, Jim, I got to go. Click. I didn't get in the questions that I wanted to. About the end of April, I called him and I said, why don't we get together for a lunch at this Oriental Cafe about 6 blocks from the federal building where he was. So I went there. It was a 1 o'clock meeting set up. I was there for about an hour. He didn't show up. Of course, there was no cell phones then, so I couldn't, run into him. The thing is that night he called me and apologized and said, well, next month, let's try it again. That happened. That happened. And then I was getting a little bit irritated with it. In the interim, I had been talking with Harold Weisberg, the critic who wrote Whitewash series of books. And we talked extensively about, Moore. He considered Moore to be a total villain, and Harold said he couldn't understand how the guy could sleep at night and this is when I first found out about it. Harold said he really threatened Dr. Perry, Malcolm Perry, who worked on the president, trying to save his life. And the question all revolved around, the neck wound, whether it was an entry or exit wound. And he expressed surprise that I haven't been able to establish a rapport with Moore. We had a number of questions back and forth on a telephone with Harold, and I sort of got a very detailed picture of what he knew about him. So I had an idea of questions I would ask him in the future if I can get a hold of him. In the interim, in March of 1971, I asked Harold, what if I acted as a broker and, asked Moore if he would speak with you? And he said, oh, no, I won't speak with him. There's two reasons. He'll give me the wrong answers. I'll know. And I can't afford to get out there. I'd rather do it face to face, but I don't have the money to do so. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, I know that another critic is going to give a presentation soon in Victoria, British Columbia. His name is Richard E. Sprague. And I said, okay. And he gave me a phone number. The phone number was for a business in Massachusetts. And then they gave me a number I could go to get Richard's number. I talked with him and he said, let's talk at the airport, SeaTac Airport, in between the flights he was coming from New York City straight to Seattle and then Seattle to Victoria. And I said, great. And so on March 29th, 1971, I met Richard E. Sprague in the airport at Seattle, and we went from concourse to concourse. He was so paranoid. We got to look for a deserted concourse to talk. Okay. And then we went to one and some people came to sit down. And then he said, we got to go to another one. this was really chewing up the time. But I talked about more with him, and I talked about the fact that my landlord gave me some information about Hosty, and he took notes. And he said, Jim, what's in the satchel that you're carrying? I said, oh, that's some photographs that I have. I'm just starting to get interested in photography. He says, oh, I'm very interested in it. In fact, I've got some 400 photographs from Dealey Plaza. And I said, oh, wow, I'd like to see some of them. And he said, well, I've got it in a presentation slides right now. It'd be hard to, you know, project them here. And he said that he had a photograph of the no grassy knoll fence line that would shock everybody. And I said, I really want to see that. And he said, well, I don't have it with me to tell you the truth. And he says, well, let me see some of your photographs. I had taken some photographs. There was a massive bombing on campus in the early part of March of that year at the Naval ROTC Center.
Oh, is that the Kent bombing at the university?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And I went there with my camera. I always carried my camera around, and I took some pictures of some guys that looked pretty much like federal agents, whether they were ONI or whatever, roaming about. So I took a picture of them. They had earphones and trench coats. They just looked the part. And I showed one of those to Sprague, and he nearly jumped up. He says, I've seen this guy before. Can I have this one? Yeah, I said, yeah, I got the negative. You can have it. And as we were going out, he said, well, I'll be in contact with you. Sprague wrote a long letter about our meeting to Bernard Festerwald, who was in the organization that Richard E. was. That led up to no real response from Harold Weisberg, other than about a month later, he got very angry with me that I even talked with Sprague. And I said, well, you told me that he was a contact. And he trailed off. This was going on back and forth. I'd call Moore and he said, well, I'm real busy. I'll call you. And then in May of 1971, I said, I've had enough. I'm going to violate his rules, and I'm going to walk up to the Secret Service office and I'm going to ask to talk with him. And I said, wow, I talked to my uncle, who was a lieutenant of detectives for Walworth County in Wisconsin. I sort of keep them up to date on things I was doing. And he thought at first it was interesting, but he said, at this point, he's not going to talk to you anyway. You might as well just quit. So I said, I'll give it one last roll of the dice. And on Friday, May 7th, 1971, I got on the bus about 1 o'clock and in the afternoon, and I decided I'm just going to go down to the downtown area where the federal building was and see if I could get in to talk with him, Elmer Moore. Little did I completely forgot there was an anti-war Kent State memorial protest downtown Seattle. And I was coming down the hills. It's very hilly in Seattle. And I noticed there were many buses loaded with riot police marching around. The bus driver said, we can't go any further. I'll give everybody transfers. I decided to jump out of the bus and took the transfer. And I was walking down into, you had to go between, you had to go down the route that the protesters were using to get to the federal building. So I'm walking down there. I had my briefcase and my backpack and my cameras, and I was walking down the street, and man, it was a mess.
Agent Provocateur is involved in that one. I believe that they were peaceful protesting.
Oh my God, it wasn't peaceful at all. But I was taking pictures, and I think it was the girls yelling out, "He's a pig! He's a pig! He's a photographer for the cops!" And all of a sudden, I'm being chased. And I get down another block, and I'm photographing this guy getting arrested by this police. And a cop took a swing at me with his baton. He says, "Give me that camera." And I said, "No." And I'm running off. I'm going down alleys. The thing is, I'm getting pretty sweaty, kind of ugly looking. And I finally made it to about, I would say about 10 after 4. I arrived at the federal building, which is got on a steep hill. And so that really wore me out. I thought, well, I'm going to be, since I've got all this equipment on me, I'm going to be frisked at the door. And there's nobody there. I walked into the thing, the place was deserted. Here's a riot 2 blocks away. You'd think there'd be some security. There wasn't. And so I went to their ornate elevators and went to the 5th floor to talk with Moore. And as I was going down the rooms of the 5th floor, so on one end of it from the elevators, my tennis shoes were squeaking. It was just annoying the heck out of me. Got to a presentation box about events coming up, and I was looking at myself in the mirror. Here I'm got hair down to my shoulders, little beard, disheveled completely. And I said, "Oh God, they'll think I'm from the Weather Underground and kick me out." So I got to the door, and it was completely silent in the hallway. But once I got inside the Secret Service office, I noticed to my left there were 2 fairly large teletype machines just chattering. It was like machine gun fire. And I got to the front desk, and there was a lady she was tapping up probably reports and stuff, and she didn't really pay attention to me. And I leaned over and I said, "Excuse me, ma'am." And she jumped up, and she probably looked at me and said, "Oh, he's one of the hippie rioters," you know. And she said, "Well, uh, Elmer probably went home." And I said, "Oh, no, I went through all this." And an agent, a young guy, said, "What do you want to talk to Elmer Moore about?" And I said, "Well, I've been talking to him about, things political for the last almost year." And he says, "Well, let me see if he's in the other side of the office." And so he came back, and he's with this guy who's about 6 foot tall. He's got light brown hair, probably about 180, 190 pounds, wearing the most god awful tie you have ever seen. He says, "You must be Jim, the guy I've been talking to on the phone." And I said, "Yeah." And he says, "Well, you having fun rioting?" And I said, "No, not at all. I've been chased by everybody, the cops, the protesters," and everybody started laughing in the room. And, it was interesting to say the least. And he shook hands with me and he says, "I've had enough. Let's go and talk. Let's go into my office." And as the way in, there was this guy that sort of looked like Mr. Burns on The Simpsons standing there. And this is my assistant agent in charge, Carl Hardy. And I hand took out my hand. He just stood there. He's just staring at me. And as we were going into the office, which I think was a conference room as well, because it had a large oak table with a glass pane across it. And there was this no, somebody called out to Elmer Moore, said, "There's a call for you, Mr. Moore." He said, "Wait a minute." And Hardy escorted me in. I sat down on one end of the table and put my camera up there and my satchel on the thing. And Hardy came right up to me, right in my face, very rudely, said, "I don't know what you people want." Elmer Moore was the lead investigator for this investigation that was the best in our history. And I said, "Well, I just want to hear more of the story." And I spelled out more rather than just say more. I said Moore. And he says, "Don't be a wise ass." And he jumped around the table, and he on his way out, Moore was coming in. And he says, "You don't talk to this kid. Don't talk to this kid." And they both went into the reception area, and he closed the door, and there was some shouting going on. And I said, "Oh my God, this is really a labyrinth to try to talk to this guy." And he came back in the room, and I said, "Listen, if I'm a nuisance, I can go." He says, "Oh, no, no, no. It's really a bad budget thing. I need at least 4 more agents. We can't cover our caseload." I said, "Oh, well, I think that, Carl should consider changing his coffee, intake." And he laughed, and we were talking there, and he said, "How would you use anything I tell you?" And I said, "Well, how about if I be your biographer?" I did an interview of a professor when I was going to University of Wisconsin-Whitewater by the name of Dr. Palanay, who was in the Hungarian Revolution, and they captured him. And I had to take a English class to go through the program I was in there, and the only one I was available at the time was a beginning journalism class taught by a man who apparently was a journalist for some time before he went and got his professorship. And I said, they took that report, my interview of it, and printed it, and it was very. I think we can, do something with this. And he says, "Oh God, no." He says, "I took an oath on this case, and I'm near retirement, and I don't want to spend it in jail." I said, "Oh, here we go. Blockade after blockade after blockade to get to this guy." And he says, "Listen, I'll tell you what. These are the conditions that I will talk with you. 1, you can't take any notes. 2, no recording, me or you. 3, if you make public anything I tell you, I will deny it. And for God's sakes," he says, "if I find out that you talked with Carl Hardy at anything, I'll make your life miserable." I said, "Okay." So,
Did you feel comfortable
so
yet?
pardon me?
Did you feel comfortable yet?
It was strange. The thing is that he says, "Let's introduce ourselves to each other. I'll start." And then he gave me his background that he was from the Bay Area in San Francisco, Oakland area. He went to a college and graduated in 32. He liked sports. He was with the Alameda County Sheriff's Department in the late 30s. And then when the war broke out, he joined the Coast Guard intelligence unit in the Bay Area. And then in 44, the end of 44, he came to uh, become a Secret Service agent. And then I gave him my background. I was from Richland Center, Wisconsin originally, and then settled in Milwaukee went to UW Whitewater, and then I entered the fine arts program in the University of Washington in Seattle, and I arrived there in 1969. And he said, "Great." He leaned back in his chair and he was tapping on the table with a pencil. Excuse me. And he says, "Well, Jim, who killed Jack Kennedy?" And he says, "I'll tell you who it wasn't with 100% certainty." And I said, "Whoa." And he says, "It wasn't the Russians." And I'll tell you why. Jack Kennedy was the Russians' boy. I will say it. He was a traitor. I didn't expect that. He went into about a 20-minute spiel about how bad Kennedy made decisions. He said that he and his brother, Robert, used a cutout that was a KGB agent by the name of Barashnikov, and that he didn't think it was a good policy to have a test ban treaty, the wheat deal, and that he had introduced an idea to Khrushchev, the premier of Russia, a joint space program situation, and that he was very upset with the idea that they didn't follow through with UN inspections in Cuba. He says maybe the rockets are still there, maybe the warheads are still there. And I said something to the effect, "Well, we know that Harding had a lot of girlfriends. He kept them in the closets." And he says, "Yeah, Jim, but at that time they didn't have any mini phones." And what Moore meant by mini phones was bugging devices. And I said, "Are you insinuating that the president was being surveilled?" And he nodded like that. He didn't say yes or no. So I took it that he meant that. So the next sec, he says, "Well, here we've been blathering on. You came here to ask me some questions. Fire away." So I said, "Well, let's talk about Oswald." Yeah, she said, "Okay." I said to him, "Did you interview Oswald?" He said, "Oh, no, I came the next Friday," is when I arrived in Dallas. He explained that after Ruby shot Oswald on that Sunday prior, he got a call from his secret agent in charge in San Francisco and said that Chief Rowley of the Secret Service demands that you get to Washington immediately. Any flight that you can get right away, get it, and directly. And he said that the week there, and this I think is very important, Moore was debriefed on what was already known and other things and how they expected him to deal with photography and organize, the investigation from Dallas with the assistance of Inspector Thomas Kelly and Forrest Sorrells, of course, who was the secret agent in charge in Dallas, Fort Worth. And he said, I didn't have a chance to talk to Oswald, but he said that Kelly, the inspector, said he was very impressed with how Oswald handled himself. He said that he was very surprised, Kelly was very surprised that Oswald was interrogated in a very small room with a lot of people in it, something that they wouldn't do. And that to move him from room to room to room was a very bad idea. but they couldn't really complain because they were guests, and there was no federal statute at that time covering the president. They couldn't directly take over, of course, the interrogation. And I said, "Oh, okay." And then I said, "Well, was the Oswald that came out of the Soviet Union the same Oswald that went in?" And he said, "What do you mean by that? A different person?" And I said, "Well, not necessarily that, but somebody that has been changed. I mean, turned to the Soviet side." And he said, "Well, there's a possibility on that. The CIA wasn't very helpful about what was going on in Russia that they knew about. They didn't share much with us." Thought that was interesting. And then he said that Oswald and Marina Oswald could have been a part of a husband wife team that the like he put it, the Reds like to use. And I said, "Oh." So we were going on about what he thought about Ruby getting and shooting Oswald, when there's so many officers in the basement there. And he says, "Well, a lot of officers knew Ruby, so they wouldn't be surprised that he was around."
So he was aware of Dallas police and Jack Ruby connections?
Yes.
Okay. Because the Warren Commission stated that Jack Ruby had no police ties.
Well, he had Ruby. I asked him at one near where we're breaking off, did he know J.D. Tibbets? And he said, probably. He says there was another Tibbets on the force, but a lot of he would entertain that carousel club. They could come in free. There was gifts. I found out later that he co-signed loans for certain cops. He definitely had ties to officers. They knew him.
Well, how could he get in the basement if he didn't?
Well, I do believe that, as a sidebar here, I talked in 2008 with Lieutenant Jack Raville of the Dallas Intelligence Unit in the thing, and I said, he said, "Oh, the only thing I can say is that Blackie Harrison, who was a detective in the juvenile division, completely failed his polygraph test about contact with Ruby." He said that there was another sergeant that knew him well, and he said he failed the questions that he answered. He was of the opinion that Ruby had inside information that day on movements. Uh, we went on after that. I asked him, "Well, what do you think the motive of Ruby was to shoot Oswald?" And he says, "Well, to be honest with you, I think he thought that he should do it because the cops didn't do it, and that his friends in the police force would, you know, uh, help him." He went on to say that there were certain laws in Texas at the time that if you did something out of malice, there was no chance that they could get life, but you could get 10. And he thinks Ruby thought of himself that he could really make a name for himself by doing, that deed. Um, we went on from Oswald to photography. That's the main thing I was interested in, because there was this Life magazine cover. Uh, I believe it was sometime in the spring of '64, and it showed the limo going down towards the grassy knoll and an out thing with a black figure there that people called the Black Dog Man. And I showed it to him. He looked at it and he says, "Oh, that's just shadows from the leaves on the trees." He was very, very hesitant, which led me to believe that they knew there was something activity there. Uh, I showed him the Hughes photograph of the sixth floor window, which looked vacated as the limo was going down Houston Street. And it was in a book called 6 Seconds in Dallas by Josiah Thompson. I showed him the picture and he says, "Yeah, I was concerned about that. It does seem like there's a fuzzy image of somebody in the window next to the open window on the sixth floor of the Texas School Book Depository." Um, Interestingly enough, there was testimony from people standing on the Rowlands, husband and wife, on Houston Street, and they said they saw a man with a rifle and another man in a suit on the west end of windows of the Texas School Book Depository. So I said, that there were numerous witnesses. Did you talk to them? He said, no. And he said that he watched the Zapruder film many times, and he said, I looked at that thing too many times. I started to get nightmares about it. But it's inconclusive, he said. Uh, at that point, I said, well, I understand that you were kind of rough on Dr. Perry when you interviewed him. And then he gave me a kind of a nasty stare and he says, "Where'd you get that from? Mark Lane?" He had to sing about Mark Lane. And I said, "No, I just read about it in other books." And he says, "Well," he said, "I was ordered to do that. You could have knocked me over with a feather." And I said, well, who orders you to do it? He said, "Well, Kelly in Washington." And then I said, "How did this all come about?" And he said, "Well, I went up there with another agent, and we both had copies of the autopsy report. This was right around the first week of December of '63. And I pulled Perry aside, wanted to talk to him about he started out with an anatomical term that he didn't understand. And then he said, well, it's possible it could be either an entry or an exit wound. Isn't that right? You know, and he kept that type of pressure on, as what he said. Others have said that he was pretty brutal about it. Said that if he continued to talk about a frontal shot, he'll lose his license. And I think that's the truth. He didn't say it that way, but he did talk about it. And then he breaks in on the conversation. He says, "Well, Jim, what is your theory on Oswald?" And I'm taken back a little bit. He's pushing me off the subject at hand. But I said, "Well, I think he was involved, but I don't think he was shooting, and I think he had plenty of help." Then Elmer Moore, looking me straight in the face, says, "Jim, you'd be surprised to know I agree with you." and I nearly passed out. I mean, I really, and then he said, well, I made a report on December 11th, 63 that said that it's impossible to track the true trajectories from the film and from the president's wounds. And I said, that's interesting. Angles are all wrong, but he didn't specify what he meant by that. It says your internet connection is unstable.
You're all right. I can still I can hear you.
Okay. Anyway, I asked him if I could have a copy of that report. And he says, oh, it's in the public domain. You can get it anywhere. Go to the archives. And he was right. It's available, but not a peep about it in the Warren Commission. At any rate, we went on to talk about Jack Ruby. I asked a series of questions. My first one was Ruby an associate of the syndicate? And he paused. He said, well, that's kind of an interesting question. He says, but I don't think he was an associate. I think he was a gopher. He was a consummate hustler that was always available. And I asked, I said, well, was he a pimp? And he said, oh, yeah, he had a separate crew of girls that he used, and he had arrangements at the Adolphus Hotel that was, I guess, right across the street from the Carousel. And I said, well, was he a gun runner? He says, oh, yes. He was very scared that they'd known that he was providing material or trying to get to the point where he would provide material for Castro at one point. I asked about the situation with the dancers, and he said he used them to his advantage, is the way he put it. He said he tried out his girls, and so I don't think he was a homosexual. And I said that Larry Crawford said he was, and he worked for him. He says, well, I don't think so. He says, I think that when I talked with Ruby, then he got into a thing of how many times that he went and talked with Ruby, which is a number of times. He went with a couple of agents 2 times, and he went to Eva Grant's home or apartment, I should say, to talk with Ruby's sister. And he went on with, he thought she was just an insane dingbat. But he realized that every time you asked a question, she would deflect it by bringing up other things. And that he noticed on a shelf, apparently, a picture of Ruby and some other people. And he asked if he could borrow it. He would get it back to her, make a copy of it. She said, yeah, keep it. He said that he went back to the office, showed it to Kelly, and Kelly grabbed it and said, forget it. It's not anything that I can use. Give it back to her, or I'll keep it. And I asked Elmer, oh, what do you remember it was in the image that it was? And he said, well, it was Ruby and a woman and another guy and a woman at a table at a club or something. I said, oh, okay. Then we went on to talk about Ruby's legal representation. And he said he was just surprised as heck that when he was talking with Earl Ruby, which is interesting because he kept on talking with the Ruby family, didn't want to have this man Howard, the local guy, handle Ruby. Well, they ended up with this guy Belli from San Francisco Bay Area, and Moore said to me, I sort of knew a lot about him, but he wasn't a very good. He very rarely handled criminal defense. He was torts. He was, real estate problems, uh, divorces, things that had to do with more civil things than criminal. And he was a showboat, and he was at his best to insult everybody in Dallas. They were hicks, and all that, and had a weird defense. He thinks that if Howard continued to be Ruby's uh, lawyer, that he would have gotten something like second degree murder or manslaughter, something like a very reduced situation. And then I started asking him about the Chicago plot. I said, did you know about or understand the man by the name of Thomas Arthur Valley? And he says, who? And I said, the Chicago incident in the first part of November. He says, oh, they wouldn't let me look at those reports. I said, he's running an investigation and they won't let him read those reports. And I said, what about Abraham Bolden? At that point, Elmer stood up and he said, that line, we took care of him. And I said, what, you did? He says, no, Kelly and the chief. A sidebar. Phil Singer and I went to talk with Abraham Bolden in 2019. And I asked him about that deal with how he had tried to warn the higher ups in the Secret Service about a meeting that about 5 o'clock in the afternoon in 61, and he thinks it was in June. Johnson came storming through the White House and met with President Kennedy and his brother, Bobby, the Attorney General. And the door closed and they were shouting and yelling and expletives. And as Johnson was leaving, he says, don't fuck with me, you assholes. And I was thinking, wow, that's pretty rough. And this is why it's important to get all the documents. Apparently, Abraham Bolden made a report on it that President Johnson threatened President Kennedy. It's nowhere to be found, of course. But as I got to that point, Moore stood up. He's snapping at me. He says, are you recording me? And I said, no. He slaps down his pistol on the table and he says, tell me who you're working for right now. And I said, I'm an independent researcher. Sometimes I talk with Harold Weisberg. And he grabs my camera and takes it apart. He's looking through my, satchel briefcase type of thing and seeing the Johnson book, the Thompson book. He puts it up on the table. He says, well, I'll pay for any of the film that I ruined. And I said, it's already wrapped. You're okay. Yeah, I said, do you want to, pat me down? And he said, no. He says, oh, he says, I'll tell you, I got to show you something. So he goes to his right to a closet that has louvers on it is white. He opens it up, he gets on his knees, and I think he was working a safe combo. And he pulls out this big black satchel. And it looked like he was struggling to get it to the table. And I said, "Can I help you?" No, no, no. I want to show you something. I said, "Okay, okay." He lifts it up on the table. He opens this big satchel, leather satchel, black leather satchel. He says, "Oh, damn it," is on the bottom. So he starts out and he takes out document holders and files and a big sheath in a big folio of photographs. And as while he's digging things out, I'm looking through the photographs, and there's a transparency, black and white, of the backyard photograph of Oswald holding a gun, And right across the chin line, you could see there's a different dot pattern, and there's speckles all over the place. And I looked a little bit further, and it looks like there's pictures of people in the crowd. And then, boom, he's seeing that I'm looking through it, and he slaps his hand down on it. And I said, "Hey, can I copy?" And he says, "No." And he gets down to a math book, elementary school math book, and he opens it up, and he has Roy Truly's signature. So when he was up on the sixth floor, he picked out a couple of the books. Apparently, he got three of them. He gave one to the Chief Jim Rowley of the Secret Service, one to himself, and one to Douglas Dillon, the Secretary of the Treasury. And then he pulls out a very nice leather presentation folio, and he opens it up and he shows me that he had received a handwritten note by Lyndon Johnson. And it starts out, that's about as far as I could get before he closed it off, was that to our best investigator, your service to me and the country is blah. And then, he closes and he opens up another one with pictures of Lyndon Johnson's signature to him. Then there was a picture of a group of men, and I could recognize Elmer Moore in it, but I didn't know who the others are. And he says, "Well, oh, wait a minute. We got to close this down now. We got to be out of here." He looks over to me I says, "Can I help you put it away?" He says, "No, no, just leave it." And he says, "Jim, we had to do the investigation the way it was done, because if we didn't, it was a very good possibility of 40 million Americans being killed." So, wow. As we're walking down the hall to the elevator, I said, "Well, what did Johnson think about?" He says, "Oh, he thought it was a big conspiracy. We do it to them, they do it to us. It's the way of the world." And so we got into the elevator, and he says, "Jim, by the way, Jim, what's your beef against the Vietnam War?" And I said, "Well, I think it's criminal to send people into combat without the goal of victory." And he says, "Here I go agreeing with you again." And then he says, "Johnson double-crossed everybody." And he just shaking his head after he said that. We got into his car because he wanted to take me home. I had to, see where I live. And we got up on Jefferson Boulevard, and it was jammed. It was rush hour traffic pile up. And so we started talking. And he says, "What branch of the military are you in?" I says, "I'm not. I was drafted, but I was given a 1Y because of my back and I'm colorblind. And he says, "Oh," says, "you didn't bat an eye when we had some activity up there." And I says, "No, but I nearly pissed my pants." And we got to my house. My ex-wife and my sister-in-law, teenage sister-in-law, and my little baby Shona uh, were at the door when I came home. I guess they were concerned where I was. No cell phones then. And I introduced him to my wife, and he tickled the baby a little bit and went downstairs, and I showed him my ceramics lab that I set up, a potter's wheel and racks for greenware and stuff. And I threw a pot for him, and he said his wife was very interested in ceramics pots. And we got out. And as we were walking back to his car for him to take off, he grabbed me by the arm and turned me around. He says, "Jim, your your wife looks just like Marina Oswald. What nationality is she?" And I said, "English, French, I don't know," you know. And he says, "Well," he goes into a thing about Marina. He says, "She lied through her teeth on almost everything." And she said that Lee Oswald beat her, and he says, "If you're really serious about looking into this thing, look into a guy by the name of James Hubert Martin, who was her first business manager." He says, "Like every case I've ever been in, this one is follow the money." And here we are, the Treasury Department, we couldn't follow the money. He says, "There's something about a Marina Oswald trust fund. You should try to look into it." And then he gets in his car and he's sitting there. He says, "Did you ever consider a career in law enforcement?" And I said, "Oh, my uncle tried to get me going on that, but I don't think so. I'm near, getting my degree, and I've gone in so far, money and time." And he says, "Well, think about it. I can help you," which I thought was very interesting. Uh, the very parting words that he did that night was, "Jim, this case will never legally be solved. Uh, Certain people will have to pass away, and then it'll probably some things will open up. But don't let this thing become an obsession with you." Look at me. I'm obsessed with, trying to find out more about everything, pardon the pun. He drove off in July 18th and 17th, I think 17th and 18th. There was a Kirkland suburb of Washington, Seattle. There was a arts and crafts fair that I signed up for, and packed everybody up, even a crib for the Shona. So I set up there with ceramics, glass blowing, and photography. And I called Moore at his office and said, "If your wife is interested in some ceramics, I'm selling it." And she says, "Hey, we'll show up." And he did, with his wife, Marion. And he came up and, says, can we take a little walk? I want to talk to you." And I said, "Okay, sure." And he kept on plugging about, "Will you want to join the Secret Service? Do you want to join the Secret Service? Blah, 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 blah." And I said, "Not at this time. I got to finish my degree." And so he looked a little disappointed. We walked back to my display, and I had a picture of that guy that Sprague took. I had a larger version, 11 by 14, printed up because I took a lot of pictures of the rioting, and people were buying that because it was so close to the. And I had some portraits. I was trying to do a portrait photography thing with black and white, see, because it's a good portrait medium. And he looked at that picture of that agent of some sort, and he says, "I know this guy." And he says, "I'll give you $10 for it." I said, "No, you can have it." He says, "No, no." pulls out a $5 and gives it to me and wraps it up. He's still looking at it as his wife Marion she bought about 4 or 5 pots, walked off. And as I got closer to my degree, this was about October of 71, I called Elmer and asked him if he knew anybody in the federal prison system in that building, and that I had an idea for putting together a crafts program in the penitentiary, ceramics or, drawing or whatever, because I had read a thing about some of the better prisons in Mexico. They do that. They have once a month, the prisoners are let out and they set up and they sell their crafts. And I thought that'd be kind of an interesting idea. And so he set it up for me with this guy that was a superintendent, and it was in the same building. And that was the last time I saw him face to face. And I said, keep thinking about joining the service. And I said, no. And in January of 72, I got on the phone with him, and we agreed we shouldn't talk about, the case anymore. That we'll get together, the way Moore put it, we'll get together after I retire in a year and a half. And don't worry, I can find you. You don't need to try to find me. And that's the last I talked with him. Happens until I'm contacted in June of 75 by a man by the name of Bob Kelly of the church committee. They became aware of me through Richard E. Sprague. Sprague had recommended that somebody talk to me. And I talked to him about my experiences with Carver Gayton and Elmer Moore. And in November, I got a phone call from a man by the name of Pat Shea from the subcommittee of the church committee with Schweiker and Hart ran about the CIA. And he said, Jim, we're going to subpoena you for January 5th, pardon me, of 1976. We'll get the plane tickets both ways for you, and you'll only be there a day. Please write us a summary of your conversations with Moore. So I did. I was very hesitant the day that I was driving down to Mitchell Field, the international airport in Milwaukee. I was getting cold feet because I was thinking that it might be an open session and I would, expose Moore and Gayton, and they wouldn't talk with me anymore. And I thought about it and thought about it. Arrived at National Airport. I got a taxi driver to drive me to the Senate side of the Capitol. He looked like a spitting image of Alfred Hitchcock. I mean, he had so many chins, I couldn't believe it. And I got to the Capitol building, and I was so impressed. Went to the Senate side, and the church committee was on the basement side of the basement of the Senate side. So I walked down these long steps, got to a reception center there, handed my subpoena to a lady who handled it to an Air Force lieutenant who said, somebody be with you in about 15 minutes. Please have a seat in our lounge. And gagged me with a spoon. That lounge was full of chairs and a dusty, smelly, cigar-ridden couch. So what I did was I got a folding chair and sat there for a few minutes, and man came up, 3-piece suit, tall fella, introduced himself as Paul G. Wallach. He was the chief counsel of the church committee. and he had his sidekick there, Dan Dwyer, who was a short little guy. Both of them were in suits, and they were very nice to me, introduced themselves, and then Wallach pulls up a folding chair and gets right in front of me, and he says, "Jim, you have to help us nail this guy, Elmer Moore. He's done the most egregious, unprofessional things that a law enforcement agent can do. Did he tell you that he personally attended the executive sessions of the Warren Commission?" And I said, "No." He didn't tell me that, but he told me that he delivered tapes, documents, notes to the White House periodically. And at that point, Wallach and Dyer turned and looked at each other and then turned away. And then Dwyer says to me, "Why would this guy even talk to you?" And I said, I built up a rapport from the first telephone conversation I had with him about uh, him saying that he was a student of American political assassinations. And we talked about Booth, and it led on from there. He said, "Okay, we'll come back in a few minutes and we'll go into session." I said, "Okay." I sat down, and then a man approached the area, and he was smoking, and he was tall, haired, disheveled, in a big trench coat. He looked like he was near death. I mean, he was so white, I couldn't believe it. And I said, "Are you okay?" And he says, "Yeah, I am." I said, "Are you being deposed today?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, "Are you?" And I said, "Yes." And he says, "Remember, tell the truth, but don't volunteer anything." And he literally had a cigarette in here, and then he was putting it out and putting on another cigarette, and it was really smelly there. finally, finally, uh, I think it was about 20 minutes. Wallach and Dwyer show up, but with an Army major. And he said, "Jim, this is Dan," and I couldn't list his wits. He is going to be the stenographer here. And very pleasant man. He shook my hand, noticed that he had a lot of service bars, and he was probably 40 years old. So we went down from the basement. They had a down escalator thing, and we got out and we walked down a long, dark corridor. And he said, "We're going to the Willard Hotel, which has been turned into a conference center and offices space. Used to be a very famous hotel in Washington, D.C." And I said, "Okay." We got in there, and Major Dan set up his equipment, which didn't look like a tape recorder, by the way. And Senator Schweiker came in, he shook my hand, and we took the oath. And just as I was sitting down from the oath, two naval officers came in, sat right behind me. One was young, one was old. They both were nearly bald, uh, expressionless robots. They were just that day before I asked Wallach who these gentlemen were, and he went over and talked with the younger one and come back. He says, "It's okay, we'll proceed." So Wallach pulled out my summary. I could see that it was my handwriting. And he went down the line with what I, told you prior in this session. Uh, we got to the part about the satchel. I started describing it, and all of a sudden, the younger naval officer starts to whisper something to Wallach. Wallach goes over to Senator Schweiker, and Schweiker says to me, "Jim, were you ever intimidated?" I was in horror. I was, what the hell? This is intimidation. That's what I belted out. And I looked back and I stared at the robots, and the robots were expressionless. They would be good poker players. At any rate, I started to say that, yes, I think I was intimidated. And it happened in August of 1971. My wife and I hitchhiked occasionally, but our bus stop was right out in front of our home that we were renting on 23rd Avenue and Thomas Place. And a guy pulled up in a very nice car, very conventionally dressed man in his, I'd say, 30s. Says, "You need a ride?" And I said, "Well, we're headed down to the University District to see a movie." He said, "Well, I'm headed that way. I'll take you." I said, "Okay." My ex-wife Marie got in the back, and I got in the front with him, and we chatted away a little bit. He says, "Oh, wait a minute." He says, uh, "If you got about 5, 10 minutes, I got to meet in the Arboretum." Huh? The Arboretum is a very big, I'd say, walking trail park by the bay there. We drove down. I said, "Okay." We drove down, and he parks right up as an abutment in the front of a very steep hill. And on my side, about 3 feet away, is a drop off into the water, And he says, "I'll be right back." And he gets out and he walks towards some people at a parking ban. There were men well dressed, casually. They weren't hippies, they weren't drug addicts. It didn't seem to me. And he walked up to him, and then I looked on the seat. The guy left a pistol. And I said, "Who in the world leaves a pistol in a seat?" You know? And I'm going through this, and Marie says, "Don't touch the thing." And I says, "Yeah, what are we going to do? We can't run away." And I was thinking, oh, maybe this is it. Maybe we're going to be in a murder suicide situation or something. Anyway, after about 5 or 10 minutes, he walked back, and I was too shattered to ask him. He picks up the gun and puts it in a holster thing, and I didn't notice the holster thing when he first picked me up. So I was very confused. But I did know this, that at the intersection, when you come out of the Arboretum in Seattle, there is a Shell station. And I said, "I got to pee. Can you let us out here? I got to pee." And Marie said, "Yeah, I got it too." We got out of the car. And I noticed he sit there for a minute, and I was about ready to make a call to the police. And he zooms off. But I said, let's take the bus this time. But at the end of me telling what happened to me in the Arboretum, Senator Schweiker stood up and he says, "This is ended. Let's go." So I was noticing on the way out, the robots were smiling at each other. And I was thinking, oh, this is not good. And I said, Wallach, to Wallach, this is really, really stressful. And he said, yeah. He says, I was totally surprised by their presence. And then he says, "Jim, can you stay overnight?" I said, "What? I don't have enough money. I don't have a credit card, and I only got $25." And he goes in his wallet and gets out 40, and he says, "We're going to put you up at the Arlington Sheraton. This is what I want to do. I want you to be in a room next to the room that we're going to interview Moore in. And if he claims he doesn't know who you are, we'll spring you on it." And I says, "Oh, okay." So Major Dan will take you to the Sheraton. I said, "Okay." So we went to a parking lot area near the Capitol, and we got in his Jeep and we're driving off, and I'm having small time conversation. I asked him if he was a Vietnam veteran, and he said yes. He went too many tours there. Uh, he was showing me. We drove past a Senator Mondale's house, and he talked about it. And then we drove through Icky, Washington, D.C. itself. I was surprised that our nation's capital is ugly. And we finally got to the Arlington. He said he'd pick me up at 10. I said, okay. At 10 o'clock, right on the button, Major Dan brought me back to the Willard. And I was in the room at about 10:30. And a young guy, uh, almost bald, I can't remember his name, came in to talk to me about Carver Gayton and what Gayton told me about Hosty. And about 1:45, Wallach came in and he had this big thing full of documents and memos and things. And he says, your buddy Elmer Moore senile? And I said, I didn't think so, no. And he says, well, he avoided questions and he couldn't remember things. I said, well, did he recognize me? He says, oh yeah, he went into you. He said that he was trying to educate you, and it was a very friendly conversations. And I said, yeah. And he did say that you were lying about certain things. We showed him, your transcript from the day before. So I know there was a transcript, and it's in anybody can see it. In Mary Farrell, they print the transcript of Elmer Moore's, deposition, and nothing happens, until 1975. And then in 77, I should say, I got contacted by the House committee, and a man by the name of Gilbert interviewed me. Have you seen that interview? I'll mail it to you. It follows pretty quick to everything that I've said so far. And 1987, I got a phone call. I was living back in Milwaukee, and I got a phone call from Judge Jim Garrison. And he said that he'd been looking into my experience with Moore. And I asked him, well, did you see a transcript? And he said, no, it's not a transcript. It's your comments to the House committee. And he said, I've got information that I've been working on Moore, who I think is an important part of this. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, is it? He said that he's been looking into Elmer Moore. He had read the transcript from the House committee, but he didn't have any idea about the church committee. See, at that point, that's when I found out that nobody has access to it, you know. Um, and then I'm just sort of quietly looking into things myself for the next few years. I get a call from Jim Douglas, who wrote his famous book, and we talked a little bit. He sort of thought that I was exaggerating about things, but he put me in his book. And then I decided to call Hosty, and I had a very good conversation with him. What Hosty's thing is, what Carver Gayton told me, that Hosty told him that Oswald was a paid informant, but he wasn't informing. And Hosty told me that he thinks that Gayton was mistaken. He thought that Hosty said, I wasn't talking about Oswald, I was talking about Jack Ruby, that they had a agent that tried to use him as a informant, but he wasn't informing on anything, is what Hosty told me. Then he went into a spiel about he really wasn't that interested in Oswald. He was interested in Marina because Marina was communicating to the Russian embassy in Washington with a man by the name of Valery Gormatsov, who Hosty said to me was the handler of all the sleeper agents in North America that really concerned the FBI. And so that was his assignment to keep tabs on her. Now, Gayton told me that Hosty told him that he'd leave messages underneath the door when they lived in Neely Street to contact him, which is against FBI procedures. I asked Hosty if he wrote notes to Oswald, and he completely denied it. Then he went on to talk about, did you read my book? And I said, no, I didn't know he had a book out at that time, Assignment Oswald. And he said, well, you should read it. I said, can I call you again? And he says, well, I'm in pretty bad health. And he did sound very bad. And I think he passed away several months later. And I said to him, well, is it true that you said to Lieutenant Jack Reville that the FBI knew that Oswald was dangerous and capable of the crime? And he said, yeah, I don't understand why Jack would say that. 2 days later, I called Jack Reville in Texas and I asked him about that. And he said, well, he had a witness at the time that he definitely said that Oswald was dangerous. And he said, well, normally Hosty would share things with him. And so he was very upset that, they didn't even inform him. And he's a part of the second in command of the intelligence division of, the Dallas police force. And I think I found out that there was a Secret Service agent by the name of Bill Patterson that was in the office in Captain Fritz's office when Hosty was there, and Hosty said the same thing to Bill Patterson, and Bill Patterson made a report about it. And I noticed that Bill Patterson was deposed by the church committee, and he did repeat the idea that Hosty told him that the FBI knew he was dangerous. So there's some very strange things going on about statements from that. And then in 2018, I go down to Dallas. Larry Schnaff has me make a presentation down there in Dallas for his group, and my friend Bob Corbis, who I want to give you his phone number, Bob Corbis. Some new stuff. He's got a number of my interviews he's done. He's also got a lot of good information. And he's been at it for, I would say, since the late 70s. And so Bob and I have gone back and forth. He's now in Oceanside, California, but we go back and forth about a lot of stuff. And we visited a second time Abraham Bolden. I've got to get a hold of Phil Singer because I want you, since you're new to the game. Oh, he got the contacts, people that you would be very interested in. I got to call him and ask him if it's okay, but I'll get to you with that. Um,
Yeah, we can talk about this a little bit off air. You given me enough of your time. We've almost been talking 2 hours, Jim. Dude, you have experiences I appreciate. I think my generation that's getting interested in the case should be appreciative of as well too. Um, you've been through a lot. The intimidation tactics on some of that stuff, I wouldn't been able to stand there.
I've had bad troubles. I tried to get from the National Archives my transcript from the church committee, and the, we don't have it. We can't find it. Is what's going on. But I have gotten some documents that I will send you periodically that fill in some of the stuff. What I've been actually trying to do is try to verify things that Moore and Gayton had told me, through other means, through other things. Um, there's documents. Are you aware of a man by the name of John Armstrong?
I am.
I'm not positive I buy his theories, but he did the most incredible research I've ever seen. And it's at Baylor University. You can tag into it. Have you done that?
Yeah.
There's really a lot of info.
I have to ask you one question. When it came to the interrogation and Hostie's notes, did they had two stenographers in that room? Did nobody write down anything else besides some notes from Bookout and James Hostie? Nobody bothered. I know they didn't have recordings back then, but they have two stenographers that could be easily writing down something.
I forgot a little detail with the Elmer Moore story. Um,
So it was a good question. Oh, look at that.
it's a very good question. I asked him about why the heck there is no transcript of Oswald's interrogation. And he says, yeah, we were very worried about that. He says he could have asked any reporter in the hall borrow a tape recorder. And he says, why didn't you tape it? When he talked with Fritz, he didn't like Fritz. I could tell. He said that Fritz gave him a lame excuse that the city council turned down buying more electronic equipment. And then Moore hit the jackpot. He said, in a robbery homicide division, they had two certified stenographers. These two ladies were there that day and they weren't utilized. So I thought that was incredible. And he was Moore was very condescending towards uh, Fritz. I wouldn't have run that interrogation any way in form like. Now, according to number of people, and Jim Lavelle, who was on the other side of Oswald when he was shot, was in there taking notes, but they never surfaced. Uh, Hosty notes are available, and Hosty wrote that Oswald said he was down at the time down at the entrance of the depository watching the parade. It's there. Uh, the prayer man thing is, yeah, it seems to me as if probably Oswald figured it out there. He was probably told that there was going to be an incident that would look bad for the the Castro Cubans. And then when he found out, I think he probably figured, oh, this is the real thing. I better get out of here. Uh, I think he was to meet at the Texas Theater with somebody because he had a dollar bill that was ripped in half. And he had a cereal box thing that was ripped in half. And he was moving from person to person in the theater. He didn't know who he was supposed to meet. So I think all of these things dovetail at some point. I know there's some wild theories and things, but I think overall, like Moore said, it was actually very simple, you know. Other people said that. I know he knew the good the story of it to a certain degree, and he made that comment that the world will have to wait until certain people pass away.
Well, we're 60 years in, so he might be right on that one.
Yeah. I think the only person left is Jenkins from Jim Wave. Uh, there are things I'd rather communicate with you by snail mail.
I I gotcha. I gotcha. No, Jim, seriously, like I said, we've been talking almost 2 hours about this. I'm gonna have you back on 100% because I'm gonna have to file up some more questions for you to get you, based on whatever you send me document wise. But I appreciate you giving me the time to do this as well too. There were some connection issues for people listening. I'm gonna do my best in the editing process to fix those. But do you have any links, Jim, to anything you'd like to promote? Do you have a website, or do you want me just to link
Oh
your
yeah, no,
interviews?
not now. I'm sort of working through Bob Corbus's thing on. He's got his website at grassyknollus.com. He's got a lot of information. He Let's see here. Let me get his phone number for you.
Well, read it to me off air. We're still recording. Let me just end this part. But yeah, yeah, don't read it on air. Do you have any place people can find your stuff, or is it just his website?
If you go to This is how I research things. You would find me by going Jim Gochenaur / JFK. Or if you wanted to go to a certain individual, let's say Buell Fraser / JFK. If you do the /JFK, you'll get what's available with that person's name.
And I'll make sure to link any links that I do find when I do that in the description so people can be able to find you. Jim, I appreciate the time. We're going to talk a little bit off air, but I want to wrap up this show without giving anybody's personal contact info out there. But Jim, thank
We'll be in contact. I'll send you material. I'll talk to the guy you must talk to is Phil Singer in Chicago. Do you know who I'm talking about?
I do. I just have no contact info for him.
I'll call him this afternoon and I'll get the okay.
All right.
He sort of trusts me.
Well, Jim, thank you again. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode about